Hello, everybody, and glad to see we could join again on Bible study through Zoom. We're getting we're getting used to zooming in together here. Our I think Kathy, we want to remember Kathy Bankert in our prayers. Her mom has been in the hospital in Casper, so she went up to Casper, and once you go into the hospital, you can't come and go. You have to stay all day or they won't let you back in. So she's been taking turns with her sister in Casper to be with her mom. But I'm happy to know that they let family in to see hospital patients. I haven't I haven't had a whole lot of input as to what's going on in our hospitals here, but recently no clergy were allowed into any hospital rooms. So we're looking at what do Christians say about white privilege, and I have printed the article. Um, we have a link to the article by Peggy McIntosh, and um, and then there's a clip from Kirsten Gillibrand. I don't know if anybody has anything to say. Let's start with the Peggy McIntosh article. Does anybody want to mention? Did they have a chance to read it? First of all, I guess I should say.
I read a good share of it, and it's interesting where she talks about men or male privilege, and at times we forget that.
Ah, it's invisible sometimes. I think I can get. I think I can get that article to show up here in a minute. And this is the article, if that helps anyone. Um, she comes up with a list of 50 things that she was able to name that she had that were invisible until she started to look at what what the advantages of walking in the world as a person with white or non-dark pigmentation colored skin. She talks about male privileges and invisible also. Um, I had not been aware of this all my years growing up till I went to graduate school. So it was a kind of like a slap in wake up call to just get you to think about why this has been invisible. How come I never even knew this? Anybody else have a wake up call when they read this?
Oh, well, I went to the same graduate school. I got the same, some of the same professors and some of the same handouts. And it really was a wake up call and a concept that I had just never really thought about. I mean, I thought a lot about racism, but this sense of privilege, and just the fact that wake up in the morning and don't have to think about race. If I'm somebody with a more richly hued skin, then thinking about race starts my day off. So yeah, it's just a world of difference in terms of how you think about yourself and position yourself in the world.
Right. If I have children, I don't have to worry about whether they will come home dead or alive. Generally speaking, that's what we've been hearing a lot lately for parents of persons of color. Their sons especially are in danger.
I think one of the things that was, when you see a list of 50 things, you kind of go, well, how am I ever going to keep all those things in mind? Like, how am I ever going to make myself be aware of or, have understanding of all that? And, the only way I can experience it, the only experiences I've had, like when I've traveled around the world and I go to somewhere like in the Middle East, and all of a sudden I'm really self-conscious, right? I mean, there's all these people around me, and they're just having a fine day, and I'm like, wow. I mean, this is kind of a funny story. I'm in Amman, Jordan by myself, and there's a little story behind that. So I walk out on the street in shorts, and then after about 10 minutes, I notice nobody is wearing shorts, men or women, and I'm like, I think I'm the weird one here, So, I mean, that's just a very, just one experience, and that's very small. But yeah, I mean, this kind of stuff is something that a lot of people have to deal with all the time.
So,
I primarily only noticed it if I'm with somebody who is a person of color and you discovered you can't get waited on. Or, I mean, you get waited on, but only after everybody else got waited on.
and then sometimes you have to ask yourself, well, was that intentional or was that not intentional? And you're guessing and trying to figure out. Yeah, and that's a stress. That's another layer of stress in your day, to just go having to wonder.
I came from a community that didn't have any people of color in it in Araba, Colorado, if you know where Araba is.
Right.
The Bethel Church of the Brethren, actually. And when I went to college in Missouri, I was in college 2 or 3 months, and the KKK burned a cross in front of our dormitory and another one in front of the administration building. And that was my first experience of anything having to do with color. And so I was never aware. My dad was very racially prejudiced, and I loved my dad. He was a wonderful guy, but he struggled with that as an issue. And I never even thought about it until I went to school.
And the privilege is that you never had to think about it. It's like what Vicki was saying. Isn't
Yeah, no,
that amazing? Just walk through life.
yeah.
You could wear shorts if you wanted to.
Well, if you just start at the top of the list, number 4, I can be pretty sure that neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. Well, and the one before is, if I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live. And then I can be sure my neighbors are going to welcome me. Those are the systemic things. I mean, it's like, well, yes, I'll take advantage of that. And yes, I appreciate it. But how do I change it so that it's available, so that everybody gets to experience the same thing? And it's in here because if you're a person of color, you may experience exactly the opposite. I'm not in charge of real estate, and I'm not in charge of banks. What do I do? How does this, it's a pretty depressing thing to read.
Right. And
Or disempowering. I feel disempowered, which of course is how everybody else is feeling if they're not privileged.
well, the first thing is that it's no longer invisible. So that's the first major step, is that I can say, I can look at banks knowing who is more open to loaning to people of color. I mean, those are some of the things that I have watched in my life, and did a bank in Chicago on purpose that I knew that was loaning to people of color in South Shore Bank and South Side of Chicago. But you'd have to know that there's a bank out there that does that stuff.
Well, you have to do a whole lot more work. You gotta dig deeper to make the shift. And I mean, you're right. It's first awareness, but then what do you do about it? How do you go find another bank? What bank? Who knows? So who knows these things?
People of color know these things.
Yeah.
Right, and there are resources. It's like homework, though. You're right, Vicki. You got to go and do the homework to be able to do those changes. And some of those things can be, like Gail is saying, banking and whatever. For some of us, that might mean, so if we have friends who are of different groups, being with them and listening to them and talking to them, and then sometimes people decide, either individually or as a group, to go live in different communities than they do. I mean, and I don't know that any of everybody's supposed to do all the same thing, but there are a lot of options, a lot of possibilities.
I
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Fred.
Well, it's not something that you give up in one sense of the word either. It's like when, for me, having male privilege and white privilege, you go to apply for a job and you walk in the room and you look around and your competition is all female for an administrative job, for example, and automatically, you've got a leg up on it, because odds are, if your interviewers are male and you're in a conservative community, you get extra brownie points just simply because you're male. And unfortunately, I think sometimes, the rest of our society plays into it. The person that headed up my accounting department, when I retired, she said to me, I hope we can get another man to serve as director. And I thought that was really interesting, because about half of the applicants for my job were female.
Oh. So built into the search engine was already an imbalance of power already.
Well, and it's how we each contribute to our own disempowerment. I mean, women buy into male privilege. Persons of color just, if you wanted to survive, you built yourself into white privilege. Otherwise, you did not survive. So, yeah, the inequities are astounding. I think it's interesting that it was her awareness of male privilege first that led her to really explore the color privilege, white privilege. So
it was invisible. That's what's so scary about it. It was so invisible for so long, for her and for me and for Vicki, and others are saying the same thing. And so then it's easy to deny as a society. Problem? What problem? There's no problem. I don't see a problem. And why don't you get over it, whatever your problem is?
It's interesting too that, as she's coming from a person that is white, she can bring up the topic of white privilege and not get as much resistance as if somebody of color brought it up.
Oh, right.
Yeah, to me, that's similar to, it's really complex, and anything we try to do to change things is, there are no guarantees. And so you have something like affirmative action, right? I mean, just to mention that word in a mixed crowd would just bring up all kinds of issues. It's gone to the Supreme Court, right? For university people, being applying to and being admitted, and of course you can have a discussion whether or not affirmative action is a good thing or how it's done, but it's just something simple as that can create incredible discussion. That's a nice word.
Well, I think there are other subtle ways that it plays as well in my community here. It's largely white, and hiring a person of color to do a job that has like I ran public welfare social services offices, and when I hired people that were caseworkers that were going to go out and do child protection investigations, there was a risk factor involved in sending a person of color into a home situation where there's very potential violence. And what do you do with that? And one of the gals that worked for me left to go to another county and interviewed. And when she went into the county, the first thing that she saw was a huge flag out in front of the house, a huge Confederate flag. And she's going, boy, I don't know whether I can work here or not. What if I get called to that house for some kind of a, domestic violence situation or whatever? And so you get into those kinds of things that it's hard to know what to do with those and how to do them.
So for safety is a concern, and then having equity is a concern. Yeah, and you have to balance. I think we've been hearing, now we have safety and freedom always with coronavirus, always trying to fight with each other,
Yeah.
where they're both highly important, but how do you balance those tensions?
And I think also what gets tied in with this some are the LGBT issues as well. I have a grandson who's transgender, and I'm learning a bunch about that through my grandson. And
Right.
it's a kind of a learning experience.
Yeah, things you've never had to think about before, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So, should I pull up the clip of Kirsten Gillibrand, or did people see that one? Would that be helpful to try to find that one? Let me see if I can bring it up. See if this will play.
When a community has been left behind for generations because of the color of their skin. When you've been denied job after job after job because you're black or because you're brown. Or when you go to the emergency room to have your baby, the fact that we have the highest maternal mortality rate in this country, and if you are a black woman, you are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth because that healthcare provider doesn't believe you when you say I don't feel right. Because she doesn't value you or he doesn't value you. So institutional racism is real. It doesn't take away your pain or your suffering. It's just a different issue. Your suffering is just as important as a black or brown person suffering, but to fix the problems that are happening in a black community, you need far more transformational effort.
I can't hear it.
Targeted for real racism that exists every day. So if your son is 15 years old and smokes pot, he smokes pot just as much as a black boy in his neighborhood. In his neighborhood, but that black and brown boy is 4 times more likely to be arrested. And when he's arrested, that criminal justice system might require him to pay bail, $500. That kid does not have $500. He might not be able to make bail. If it's an adult with a child at home and he's a single parent, if he's thrown in jail, no one is with his child. Doesn't matter what he says. I have to go home. I have a child at home. He's only 12. What am I going to do? It doesn't matter. Imagine as a parent how you would feel so helpless. That's institutional racism. Your son will likely not have to deal with that because he is white. So when someone says white privilege, that's all they're talking about, is that his whiteness will mean that a police officer might give him a second chance. It might mean that he doesn't get incarcerated because he has just smoked a joint with his girlfriend. It might mean that he won't have to post bail. It means he might be able to show up to work the next day and not lose his job and not be in the cycle of poverty that never ends. That's all it is.
Okay. I don't know if you could hear that. I hope we got some of that technical stuff fixed out. So the question from the audience was, we're in Youngstown, Ohio. There's a lot of unemployment and people living in poverty, and so what is why is white privilege not what does white privilege have to do with my pain and my suffering is what they were asking, and so she kind of explained that in her clip. It seems to me that we might want to look, I'll try to screen share again with these questions and see if we have any thoughts to share. Yeah, does white privilege mean that you were raised with economic privilege? I think she was trying to explain that.
I was thinking about this topic before tonight, and I know in my family nobody went to college, and so there was not the expectation that I was going to go to college. And so when I wanted to go to college, I didn't really know how to navigate the college system, how to get a decent schedule of classes, and which line to stand in. I didn't have anybody to show me or tell me how to do it. And I ended up making some poor choices and dropped out. So economic privilege and white privilege and educational privilege, all that stuff kind of rolls together sometimes.
Absolutely. And how do you even get into a college if you apply? Where are you supposed to apply? How do you get scholarships? Those things aren't written down anywhere that I know of. Maybe they're on the internet nowadays. I don't know.
Well, and Rochelle, I also am a first generation college student in my family, but I'll bet I'm sure I got more help than you're describing, right? And so that's another way of the privilege thing, and because I didn't know anything either, but I bet I got more because I'm white and I'm male.
That's probably right.
Yep.
I think we probably started, well, we're almost the same age, just the same. Right. But you were on the East Coast in Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah, Pittsburgh, area, yeah. I mean, and those things have differences, make differences as well. Yeah.
One of the things that McPherson College is doing is reaching out to first generation college students, and so they have a high percentage of persons who have never had anyone attend college before in their family, and so that's one of the ways that they might be able to hopefully start to unpack some of this stuff about privilege, where kids are coming from. So that's one small school in small town Kansas trying to make some differences.
If I remembered right, McPherson was pretty white in the old days too, wasn't it?
Except for the football team.
Oh, is that okay?
It was very, very white, and I remember that back in the late 50s, early 60s, one of the girls, white girls from Iowa, wanted to marry a black. And this caused a big ruckus in the town.
In the town of McPherson, or her home?
Yes.
In the town of McPherson?
Yes.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
What I know about McPherson now is that you can go into Walmart and you'll see lots of variety of color, but that's during the day. At night, McPherson's all white, is what I've been told.
Oh, interesting.
So it goes back to a whole bunch of those things from Peggy McIntosh. But this thing about you can be economically disadvantaged and still have white privilege. You can also, I mean, so, but poverty, economic disadvantage also has commonalities with lack of privilege, as you were talking about schools, but white privilege is not, they're not the same boxes of wealth and economy and whiteness. They're different boxes
I
that
think
overlap.
I think Kristen Gillibrand says it like it's another layer that you don't have to worry about when you wake up in the morning. So you have economic disadvantages, but here's one more layer that you don't have. All these 50 things that Peggy McIntosh. That helped me kind of see why it's such a big deal, and not just for not just well, everybody's could have could be disadvantaged. Well, it's different if you're a person of color.
I think the word that gets used a lot here, and correct me if I have it incorrect, is intersectionality. That's the word that comes up a lot in terms of how all these different parts and pieces play out for individuals. Sorry.
Right.
So,
Which means that women have disadvantages, as well as persons of color, as well as differently abled people have differences.
That's really true. When I had that big giant oxygen tank that I was dragging around behind me, I realized, I was trying to take the bus to go to work, and there's not a lot of the ramps sometimes would be blocked, or the snow would be so high that you couldn't use the ramp. And I thought, how am I supposed to even do this with, I'm
just a
walking
second, just a minute.
besides, somebody that's in a wheelchair. Somebody in a wheelchair couldn't navigate this mess.
Right. And that's invisible to people who have two legs mostly, isn't it?
Totally. And I also noticed people giving me weird looks because I had an oxygen cannula in my nose, just like, and that tank, like, what's wrong with you? And I had a customer at the library that came in and said, well, I don't know what that is. I don't want to work with you. And he turned around and walked out. And I was like, it's oxygen. It's no big deal.
Wow. Wow. So when we look at does the Bible have anything to say about privilege then? That's one of the things I wanted to try to explore. And so we have a Galatians passage. Does someone want to read that 23 through 28 passage?
I can do it. Before the coming of this faith, we were held in custody under the law, locked up until the faith that was to come would be revealed. So the law was our guardian until Christ came that we might be justified by faith. Now that this faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. So in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith, for all of you were baptized into Christ, who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus.
Okay, so what does that have to say about who's more privileged than someone else in the scriptures? Is there any hierarchy here?
Well, they say that there's not. I'm sure that there was still, even though, people are hard. It's hard for people to change. And especially the female and male, because women were subjugated, very much so. And so Jesus modeled how women were equal, you know, by talking with them and including them and saying stories and parables about them and treating them right.
Yeah, that sounds like jaw drop, shocking, um, countercultural to me, what you just described, Rochelle. So the culture definitely was not saying male and females are equal, Jews and Gentiles are equal. But here comes Jesus saying, you are all children of God. That's, that seems like awfully news. I mean, that would be frontline news, I think, in the era that we were living, that Jesus was living in. And what about today? Slave nor free, male nor female. How are we doing on that scripture so far?
Well, and unfortunately, and at least where I am, there are a lot of folks that I think use the scriptures, particularly Paul's writings about women and their involvement in the church, and they use that to keep women down and limit women's ability to move forward in the church.
Right. So Paul is, if we're going to use Paul, we have to have the full spectrum, don't we? And if you just pick one or two verses out of Paul, you could justify either any direction you want to go, I think. We've been talking about Paul and some of the other Bible studies.
Did you, Gail, as a female, get pushback for being a pastor?
I have had the privilege of having people who've gone before me, so I think I'm standing on some of their shoulders. I think there would be some churches that I know that I would not need not apply to be their pastor because they would not want to even interview me. So I don't know. I think that people in seminary ahead of me certainly opened the doors for me. So I'm very grateful for a lot of things I have received. And sometimes I'm just too stubborn to let a door be closed. I don't know. I don't know if I bust down too many doors or not, but I certainly, I mean, look at my district. I have Vicky's my moderator for my district. I have a female district executive, and so there's not a glass ceiling that I have to bust through. So I'm grateful for that.
And is that unusual in the Church of the Brethren as a whole?
For geographically, it varies. We've had a woman who's been ordained for over 100 years, and so we've had a tradition. People have been ordained in the Church of the Brethren as currently and as full members of the clergy for 50 years, which compared to Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, anybody else, we're pretty far ahead. But it doesn't mean that the doors are still slammed shut for several of us.
Well, and I think one of the ways to understand that is, when we come to read a passage from the Bible, we have glasses on, like I do, I mean, that we don't even know we have on. That's the culture that we grew up with, or who we are, or where we went to school, or who our parents were, and all those kinds of things. And if we're fortunate, somebody helps us see that there's other kinds of glasses you can put on, or that you have to take off blinders sometimes, because that's what I think Paul is doing in this passage. He's saying, look, there are blinders that Jesus wants to take away. He wants to give you sight. And, he's dealing, of course, with that culture 2,000 years ago, and we're in a different place, but, we still have the principle, is there. Now we get to work out and know that Paul, perhaps wrote some things that he maybe wouldn't write today.
Well, it certainly was dependent on the culture and the context. And so, like we say, every text has a context.
Sure. And if anyone changed a lot in the Bible, it was Paul. from
Right.
Saul to Paul, right? I mean, he changed a lot. Maybe not all the ways that he could have, but he sure did change a lot.
Right. And he said, I'm going to stop killing these new Christians and start becoming one of them. Allow everybody else to come in.
Yeah, good start.
Yeah, stop killing each other. That's a good start. So the interesting thing of the very next verse is Galatians chapter 4, and this kind of gives an interesting context to me about equality. So right after 28 is verse chapter 3, 28 comes chapter 4, verse 1 through 7. Does someone want to read that passage out loud?
I will. What I am saying is that as long as an heir is underage, he is no different from a slave, although he owns the whole estate. The heir is subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. So also when we were underage, we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir.
So does this make sense to what culture Paul was living? So we know that there was hierarchy. Do you see what hierarchy there was when Paul was living in that culture? Who was at the top of the hierarchy heap in that culture?
The emperor of Rome.
Right, and in this passage, it's the father who, even if you are the son of a wealthy estate owner, you're still nobody. You're nothing until the father tells you that you can come into the wealth of all your inheritance. And so all of a sudden, Jesus said, you get to inherit all of that wealth of of what God has bestowed upon you. So there's no longer anybody who's an underage. Everybody is born into this kingdom where you get to be the son of God. Whoa! What do you mean? I'm the son of God. I'm the daughter of God. I've totally leveled off all of those hierarchical playing fields, and now I inherit all of these, all of this wealth, all of these blessings. I'm an heir. Wow. I never saw the will. So what is that? So what do you think that did to people who were the slaves in that society? What was happening to slaves in that society? We got a silent crowd today here.
I would guess if I was the master of the slaves, I wouldn't want them to hear that. I've been trying to push them down all these times.
Maybe this is a passage they didn't read in the slavery days, right?
Right,
We'll just skip over that passage and go right to the one, slaves obey your masters, right?
right.
Written supposedly by the same guy, written supposedly by Paul in both cases. I would imagine it might have started an uprising.
Well, we do
Well,
know. Go ahead. Go ahead.
it did cause problems in the Caribbean with it caused people to not want to allow the Negro slaves to learn how to read, because then they could read the Bible for themselves, and then they might really want to uprise. They might really want to be saved, that they were equal, and so they stamped down in the 18th century they stopped and it made it illegal to teach a slave how to read.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, and and we do know that. I mean, there were no church buildings when this stuff was written, right? I mean, the church was meeting, in people's homes, or it's underground. I mean, they're gatherings, and like last week, it was about, well, who gets to eat, right, and who's in charge of food. I mean, they're having to deal with all these very, very mundane but really, really important things, um, and especially if you're a slave, right? I mean, it's just going to be. Um,
Well, it's
it's a great message, but you got to put it to work.
life changing,
Yeah, yeah,
and until you get killed.
yeah.
And so this last passage, then, what was interesting to me was to see the order, chronological order of these books of the Bible. And so there's some debate about this, and um, so Lyle and Dave, you might want to chip in here, but what I'm seeing is that Galatians was one of the very earliest written while Paul was in prison, and so we know that he kept this theme going. He didn't just mention it; he mentioned it really, really early in his writings. So it was critically important. But then, did he ever mention it again? Well, all of a sudden we have a passage in First Corinthians. Then someone want to read that passage?
I'll read it, but I have to adjust things. Let's hear. Just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we were all given one Spirit to drink.
Thank you, Greg. And so, how is there hierarchy? Is there privilege in this passage? What's the leveler? What takes the privilege away in this passage?
But we all have one Spirit, so
Maybe,
so maybe Christ.
all given the same spirit, all given the same spirit to drink, so no one gets more spirit or better spirit or special spirit or advanced and primitive. There's all just one. So the body is, we all form one body. So there's another passage where the hand can't fight with the foot and say, I'm better than you, or the eye fight with the ear, I'm better than you. So it's a really interesting, um, he keeps repeating this. And so it must have been something that he really wanted people to understand. So so here we go. I think you can certainly find it we found it in Galatians, we find it in First Corinthians, we find it in Philippians, I believe. And he keeps this message going all the way so that there isn't just one time. It's privileges. It makes us all on a level playing field so that we're all children of God. They're not some more special than others. So this was an illustration that I have recently seen but hadn't known when I was in college or in graduate school, the difference between equality and equity. Has anybody seen this illustration before? Vicki, she's gone to school. I got to change my screen here. Anybody else seen it before? Okay, Vicki wins. Okay, what do you want to tell us what it means, Vicki? No, no. So equality is that, we keep saying that equality is a good thing, but equality can still have very uneven um, outcomes. So if you give everybody the same box, it doesn't help if you started off with no height at all, if your legs are shorter than everybody. So if I give everybody a chance to be on this above the fence line, then that's equity, so that I can have equity for all. And then, here's one where they have to build something even more special, a ramp. Let me see if I can get this bigger here. they have to build a ramp so this person can even be part of society, can see over the fence. And so when we talk about affirmative action, this is where the fight starts in. And it's like, well, why should that person get 2 boxes and that person only gets 1 and this one gets nothing at all? And affirmative action might have a place where it says, we're not going to cross the finish line if we don't figure out how everybody can finish with the same level of advantage or the same level of privilege, so that we can all finish together. This guy's legs are a lot longer than anybody else's, so why wouldn't that be acceptable, that some people would get more than others depending on how they were, what they started off with? So when I have to catch myself when I talk about equality, because that might not be far enough for people who've been come along without anything. How does that strike anybody? Anybody have a reaction to this visual here?
I saw another visual. There was it was a thing where the video where everybody was going to start a race, and they said, okay, everybody that has, white parents, take a step forward, and if you have, this privilege, that privilege. And so it was like a lot of people had a head start in the race already because of all of the privilege that they had.
Like if you have health insurance, or if you have a driver's license, or whatever. Right.
Yeah, just simple things like, a savings account, or, whatever.
Right. Or a person who's been to college before you.
Well, and you don't even know, this is a great example too, if you don't even know you have the privilege or the advantage, you just don't know it. If you are at the disadvantage, if you're in a wheelchair, then you know it, you see it, you feel it, you experience it. And so it's easy to be clueless, and it's really easy to be aware, depending on what you're bringing to the table, so to speak.
Right.
One of the places that they still encourage hierarchy is in the medical field, doctors and nurses. And it's very much who has the most education is higher up on the pile. And so I worked at Vista Adventist Hospital, and they used to have a day or a week, I think, where the doctors took the nurses' role and the nurses were in charge. And it was real interesting to see the doctors humbled at not knowing where to find things and not knowing what to do when they had all this power,
That's pretty interesting. I would love to be a fly on the wall. See that one.
This image makes me think of the current COVID crisis, and how we're supposed to take care of each other and wear a mask and be careful and not to spread COVID, because it's not just for ourselves, but we got to protect our elderly people and people who are vulnerable, like say if they had breast cancer or something, and not just have this attitude like, well, this is a free country, I should be able to do what I want to do, and we have to think of everybody and not just ourselves.
Right. And it would be easy to just say, well, I'm not going to wear a mask. Why should I have to wear a mask because I don't need one? And
Right.
then these two are dead at the
That's
end of the
right.
day. Right. So, Vivian or Lyle or Howard or anybody who's been politely quiet, you have any insight, COVID or otherwise? Or Donna or anyone?
when you've been in Nigeria and you're suddenly the one that's not the right color, you kind of get the feel of it. Or if you get in the market and you realize I don't have my head covering like everybody else or whatever, and you have to be sure you wear a dress instead of jeans or something, all those things you have. Or if you end up with a driver that can't speak your language and you have to try to communicate, you kind of get a little bit of the other side.
You're the underdog.
Right.
Yeah, we call that dominant culture. And when you're no longer the dominant culture, it feels different. It feels
It
strange.
really does. Yeah. But when I was in McPherson, when Lyle and I were in McPherson, the college made an effort to bring in people from other races. Like we had Nigerians there, and we had one lady from the South, I think Little Rock, Arkansas, or somewhere where several years later she thanked us for taking her up to Salina for an interview so she could become a nurse, because she had such a time getting around, and the buses weren't going at the right time. And
And you had a
so
you had a car, or Lyle had a car.
Lyle had a car, and Lyle took her and I up, and so she could do this interview and got her ability to become a nurse. And then she went to California and was over a lot of nurses. But we didn't know that till she saw us several years later and thanked us profusely. So yeah, the people you were around, and we had people from Greece. So they made an effort to bring in people from other countries at that time.
Right. So that was somebody's awareness.
Right. And Spanish people too.
My dad talks about a Japanese woman who came from the internment camps that McPherson brought in when he was a student there to help them be out, not have to be in prison in those camps in the 40s.
Gail, one of the term white privilege made me think back to our days in Nigeria, when there was definitely white privilege, and at times I fought it, we fought it, and some of the Nigerians would say, be quiet, this is a part of our culture. In other words, if you were a chief or the ruler or someone high up in government, you would be given one of the best seats in the house. You would be given food before others would, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at one point I thought, now, did the early missionaries demand that the Nigerians give them all this honor and respect? And the answer was no, it was just a part of the culture.
So
But it bugged me at times. It bothered me at times.
every text has a context, and certainly there is hierarchy.
And the Nigerians said, you have to respect our culture. Quit fighting it.
So they needed Paul, the apostle, to come in. Howard, Jan, or Lyle, you have anything you want to add? Oh, Lyle, you're still muted. You gotta unplug something, Lyle.
My mic doesn't work on my earphones, so that's the problem. Yeah, in Nigeria, white women are honorary men. So Vivian would eat with me while the wife would wait until the men and her had eaten. Then if there's food left over, the wife and children would eat. And but I had a friend in Nigeria who said it wasn't until he went to college in Kansas that he experienced racial prejudice. And McPherson, as a town, was extremely narrow-minded. They were racist. They were anti-peace and anti-Holderman Mennonite, because the Holdermans dressed a little strange, in plain clothes, and showed up. And when we were there, the Holdermans did not buy in Nigeria. Buy in McPherson, because their kids had been beaten up for being pacifist in World War II.
Wow. Wow. So this message of equality and equity is still being parceled out, I guess, still being figured out, so that we have not finished the job of figuring out how to live together. And that's what we're finding. People are trying to educate themselves about racism, because I think there's more people realizing that they just didn't know what they didn't know. Well, I think our time is about up. I'm going to pause the recording here and a second.